For the longest time, I secretly wanted more. I often found myself shrinking to fit in, settling for what was comfortable, and even selling myself short. Once I finally accepted that we deserve success and we are blessed with the power to achieve it, I stopped playing small. I'm serious about building a life I love, and you should be too. I'm Denise Taylor of DeniseTaylor.live, and welcome to Life, Love, and the Pursuit of Happiness. I help women prioritize themselves, their success, and their happiness. Let's meet this week's achiever whose story will inspire you to push past your fears and soar. Well, hello, it's Denise Taylor. I'm always excited to have you join me here on Life, Love, and the Pursuit of Happiness. There's always something great going on as we talk to everyday people and listen to their overcoming stories. The reason why that is important is because the Bible tells us that we can overcome by the testimony of others. We can be encouraged by them, and yes, we can be empowered by them too. Even more, I believe that we can build a life that we love without apology. We don't have to make excuses. We don't have to apologize. Whatever life makes love resonate in our heart is one that we deserve. I want to always encourage you with the success superpowers. Superpower number 1 is see yourself successful. Number 2 is embrace your power and go. Number 3 is do the work. Number 4 is take care of you. And finally, number 5 is hold fast to your faith. The reason why those superpowers are significant is because I believe that you can apply them to every area of your life and see success. You can achieve success on your own terms. Now, today's achiever, I am so excited to introduce to you. This concept of fatherless daughters is one that hits home. And the key thing is, it doesn't have to mean that your father was absent from the home for you to have this experience. You see, as we unpack this subject today, we're going to begin to realize how it plays into our limiting beliefs, how it plays into a lot of things that keep us bound. Today's guest is Bernadette Jackson. I'm so excited to have her join. She is a relationship strategist, and she has taken this journey to discovering how to overcome the trauma that she experienced from being a fatherless daughter. And even more, she is now reaching out to serve and support women who have to take that journey as well. And so I invite you to listen for how key it is to shake off fear as you listen to this conversation. Superpower number 2 rings through and permeates the dialogue because a lot of times our past experiences keep us bound. As I talk to Bernadette, who focuses on helping women get free, I want you to think about your own experiences and see if there's an opportunity where you need to shake off fear more to secure your freedom. I'll see you on the other side. Well, welcome again to this episode of Life, Love, and the Pursuit of Happiness. Now, today is a very, very tender spot, and I think we're going to anchor in on how to really bring beauty from what may be ashes. Today, it's about love. It's about self-love, I believe, and Bernadette will confirm that for us as we share. Bernadette is sharing in an area where so many women have experienced both overt and covert trauma, dealing with daddy issues. Fatherless daughters, as she has coined and as she serves, is a trauma that is a reality for many. And through her own life experiences, she was able to get to the why she allowed relationships to weaken her resolve and make her powerless in ways that she did not want. But what I really love is she embraced her power, and she turned that power into serving others. She would crave validation in ways that she knew was not in her best interest as a woman. And she just kept finding herself in unhealthy relationships. And then the wake-up call came. as they were robbing her identity and robbing her confidence, where she decided to turn it around. Now, the interesting thing, Bernadette, is you were able to make the connection of how you were in relationships to the aspect of being a fatherless daughter, which we're going to dive in more and understand exactly what you mean by that. And I love how now you are empowering other women to make that shift and change for themselves and helping them to regain their confidence and their resolve, much like you have. And so I want to welcome you to Life, Love, and the Pursuit of Happiness. And if you will, introduce yourself to us so we can learn a little bit more about you.
Thank you so much for having me on, Denise. It is an absolute pleasure to be here. My name is Bernadette Jackson, and I am a relationship engagement strategist. And I help fatherless daughters to discover their father's story, understand their fear based responses, and identify their transparent truths. Because I know that what our heart's desire is for us to have amazing relationships. And the thing is that we haven't been taught the tools in order to get that. So I create the safe spaces for them to learn, grow, and heal so that they can have these tools to both attract and maintain the types of relationships that they have always yearned for.
Now, before we go too far, this is what I want to say to you. I want to say thank you. Thank you for showing up transparently and authentically and serving in this way. Because a lot of times we don't make connection with this childhood trauma that grows up with us and how it's impacting us.
Yeah.
And when we do make a connection, we often feel ashamed, we feel compromised, we feel alone. And you fought through that. You fought
Yes.
through all of those emotions to not only rise up strong for yourself, but to tell your story. And so, before we even get to your story, I want to say thank you for that. And I thank you because you are helping to set others free in this space, and that's huge.
I appreciate that. I really do. And honestly, like I am truly honored to do this work. It's something that the Lord gave me to do, and I ran from it from a little while, but just being in this space and really getting to engage with women in this way, it really is my honor to be doing this for them and just to be walking with them on this path because I believe that healing happens in community. And I just want to create a community for them to feel safe to be able to be authentic in.
All right. So now, share your journey as you prefer, and help us understand more about how recognizing how being a fatherless daughter, daddy issues, impacted you.
Yeah, I really feel like it would be a disservice for me to start by saying that, I just happened to be the person that I am today. It really wasn't like that. I spent years, and when I say years, I'm talking about upwards of 15 years, like intentionally being removed from relationships. And it was the result of my not having my father there. I grew up in a home that was mostly my mom and I. My dad didn't live that far. And so he had the opportunity to really come down and to build a relationship with me, but he just chose not to. And so a lot of what I realized as I was going through my own healing journey was that I internalized his choice to mean that something was wrong with me, that it was my fault that he didn't want to be there, that it was something that I did, it was something that I wasn't, whatever it was. And so I always just try to prove my worth in relationships. And it was really the connection of me understanding that not having my father around made me feel like I didn't have worth or value. And because I felt that way, I always felt like I had to be doing things in order to gain people's love. I always had to be overextending myself. I always had to be putting myself in uncomfortable situations. And I didn't want to be doing that anymore. And what happened for me is that one day on I want to say maybe my 33rd or 34th birthday, I was sitting at home alone in the dark. It was cold. And I just didn't have anyone that was wishing me happy birthday. I was alone. And I was just like, I don't understand how it is that I'm at this place again. And the reason why I was saying that was because just 3 days before that, I had broken up with the man that I thought was going to be my husband. And he ended up not being, because he was just not ready for the type of relationship that I wanted. And, I had sat with that for so long because I just didn't understand why I kept having failed relationship after failed relationship. And I cried out to God. I mean, I was upset. I was yelling. I just was blaming him, like, why do you keep allowing this same thing to happen? And what he told me in that moment was that I was the common denominator in all of these failed relationships. And that was like a punch in the gut, because I was like, excuse me, like, I'm the common denominator. Like, I haven't done anything wrong in these relationships. I wasn't the one who cheated. I wasn't the one who lied. I didn't do any of these things. I showed up. I tried to prove my worth. I did everything they asked, all of these things. But it wasn't until he said that and I sat with that for a while that I understood that, yes, my father wasn't there. And yes, I had not experienced that type of love, and I hadn't seen what healthy relationships were like. But I had the responsibility to heal from that so that I could start to experience the relationships that I wanted to have. And so what I realized in that moment is that up until my healing, I was accepting what was familiar to me in relationships, which was emotional unavailability. People who just like did the same things that my father did. And until I healed, and I like to call it pre-healing, I was accepting what was familiar. It was absolutely what I knew. It was the norm. And so people who showed up in the same way, like, to me, that was just what it was. This is the type of relationship that I wanted, and it was what I was comfortable with. And so when I actually started to be intentional about my healing, I started journaling. I started to do a deep dive. I researched everything. I tried to really find out, how does fatherlessness affect women? And how does it show up in relationships? Because I know that there is a connection between the relationship with your father and how you expect to be treated from a man. And so when I understood what that connection was, I did a lot of soul searching. I prayed. I did all the things. And I really kind of was in a cocoon for about 3 years, where I was really just working on myself and doing the research and finding out everything that I could about this, because I wanted for it to be different. I knew that there needed to be radical implementation of some new things in order for me to see what I wanted to see. And so I just spent that time just deep diving into myself. I got curious about who I was. I rediscovered like my likes, my dislikes, my values and things. And I started to carry those things into relationships instead of what I previously did, which was my fears of rejection and abandonment, the shame around my father not being there. And that is really how I got to a place where I started to have the type of amazing relationships that I really deserved and that I was always yearning for. But it started with me just being intentional about healing. And that is when I started to attract what I really wanted.
Okay. So you said a lot, and we're going to unpack it because I think it is critically important. So on this journey, you found yourself with an overwhelming and very real sense of loneliness.
Yeah.
A sense of you truly needing to take time and space to reckon with where you were. And what I love about that moment is how you got revelation and God showed up to kind of give you some in the face clarity about what was going on. And in that moment, he said that you're the common denominator, which I think is so huge. And before we add to it, I want to just take a journey and unpack what you said. Yeah. When he said you're the common denominator, you were challenged in that moment to do a self-reflection about you and what you brought to these relationships.
Mm-hmm.
So help us understand a little bit, about that self-reflection journey, and how difficult was that for you to go deep inward to see the things that you saw?
Oh, yeah. It was really hard, honestly. Like it was some of the hardest work that I had to do.
Mhm.
And in the moment when I was actually doing it, I had to decide, like every single day I had to make the decision that this is the hard that I'm going to choose. Like either I'm going to choose the hard of like getting through this and working through this and really getting on the other side, or I'm going to choose the hard of continuing to have these like failed relationships. So when I did like some self-discovery, and when I was actually just like taking a deep dive into how my father loss affected me,
Mhm.
I understood that fear was really the driving force behind everything that I was doing.
Mhm.
Everything that I did was because I was either afraid of being rejected, afraid of being abandoned, afraid of somebody telling me that I wasn't good enough, being found out if I didn't know something, afraid of letting people know that I needed help in certain areas, all of these things. And so the way I always showed up was as, definitely removed, in that I did not bring my authentic self to any relationship that I was in.
Mhm.
I always gave you a little bit, enough for you to be able to say that you knew me, but not enough for you to be able to like, touch the parts of me that were really vulnerable and really sensitive.
Mhm.
And so a lot of what I did was to just create an atmosphere of like doing everything for the person that I was in a relationship with. And if I created this space where they needed me for everything, I knew that they wouldn't leave me. But what that was doing was really, it was me just saying to myself that my needs and my desires didn't matter at all.
Mhm.
And I'm just going to ignore myself and abandon myself really in service to this person, because this is the only way that I felt that I was going to show that I was valuable enough to be loved in the way that I had always wanted to be loved by my dad.
Wow.
And so it was just, like understanding that was really kind of the start of where I was able to work through that, but then also like pivot to understand that my needs and my desires need to be prioritized just as much as someone else's does.
Mhm.
And how is that going to look going forward for me? Because it
Yeah.
was new.
Yeah, yeah, and that's huge. Um, one of the things that I say in the journey of finding and emerging as your successful year is that you have to shake off fear. And
Mm-hmm.
what you talked about is exactly how I like to describe it, as being false evidence appearing real.
Mm-hmm.
You had all of these different things that you were so fearful of that made you create this protective layer where you would kind of show up almost like a chameleon of what you needed to be in each of those circumstances. And none
Yeah,
of those things were completely you, right? And so when you did
exactly.
emerge, it wasn't anything close to what you were putting on. And that's when the fractures start in the relationship, because you start to see, well, that's not really me. And that's not really what I think. And that's not really what I want out of this relationship.
Mm-hmm.
And when you bring yourself forward, that's when it starts to fall apart. I love that. Okay, so the next thing you said, I took notes because I got to make sure that I unpack this. You said you began accepting what was familiar.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that is a very key revelation that you got to, is
Yeah.
that you saw the repetitive nature of the relationships and you began to liken them to what was familiar to you, and why that accepting those things were okay. Help us understand a little bit more with that.
Yeah, so really what I said there is that the characteristics that I experienced with my father, which is the emotional unavailability, the not taking ownership of anything, the manipulation and things like that, those things were familiar to me just based on my relationship with him. And because they were familiar, it's what I looked for in partners pre-healing.
Mhm.
And so for me, what I ended up realizing is that when I made the connection between how my fatherlessness affected me in relationships, that's one of the big things that came up. That not only did I realize that I was emotionally unavailable, and I had done that purposely because I didn't want to be hurt, but I was also choosing partners that were also emotionally unavailable, but then yearning for a connection with them that clearly was never going to come. So that is one of the things that was really like a game changer for me when I really understood what this had meant to my relationships pre-healing.
Oh my gosh, that's so, so good. Now, this little phrase you threw out, I wrote it down. I'm probably going to steal it someday. So, just in case you hear it, you said radical implementation of some new things. I
Yeah.
love everything about that phrase. Tell us how that came to life for you.
Man, like honestly, for me, I know that the things that you focus on are the things that are going to grow. And so for me, like I could no longer sit back and focus on the fact that my father wasn't there and what that meant for me and that he didn't choose me or whatever it was. I couldn't focus on those things anymore. I needed to focus on my healing. What was that going to look like? How did I want to show up in relationships? And what was I going to do every day to commit to myself that I was going to get to where I wanted to be? And so the only way that I was going to be able to do that was really radical implementation. It meant that I was going to have to throw away all of my old responses, all of the fear-based responses that I used to the things that I was triggered with, and I was going to have to replace them with transparent truth statements. I was going to have to get super clear about what I wanted in relationships and start to tell people, even if my voice shaked and even if I was scared, because they needed to know that I knew that my priorities and my needs and my desires were just as important as theirs, even though I didn't think so before. So a lot of it was really just to me asserting myself in situations that I hadn't previously done. And even though I was scared and I was really quaking in my boots a lot of the times doing these things because I didn't know what the outcome would be, what I found out is that when I came to the table authentically and I told people exactly what I needed in the moment and how I could be supported and how I needed help or what my desires were, people who cared about me respected and honored that, and they wanted to show up for me in these spaces. And the more I understood that and the more I got to experience that, the easier it became for me to just be who I had always wanted to be, even if I didn't always know how I was going to do it. So really, it was just a matter of me looking at what I was doing and deciding that I was going to do the complete opposite. And a lot of it did happen to be trial and error. I tried some things, I'm not going to lie, and stuff just didn't work out the way I wanted it to. But the more I did things, the more I put myself out there, the more I was honest about what I wanted and really just, letting people know and asking them to partner with me. Really, it was a slow crawl, and it's a journey that I say that I'm always going to be on, but it's one that as I have taken it the last 5 years, that I've realized that I've become so much better at just honoring myself and the way I want to be loved, the way I want to be supported, and letting people in on that as well, instead of expecting them to know what I need and then being upset when they don't actually give that to me because I haven't verbalized it. So these are some of the ways that I really did that.
Listen, if anybody is looking for a mantra, that's one right there.
Yeah.
Radical implementation of some new things. And I love how you almost have this before healing and after healing perspective, because that's very key.
Yeah.
And that distinction allows you to set the right rules of engagement, the right boundaries, the right standards, everything that's necessary for them to honor who you are now. I love it.
Yes.
All right. So now this is where I want to go next, because I know some people may say, well, my dad was there. Okay. And Bernadette's telling a story. Her dad wasn't there, but my dad was there. And I want you to take a few minutes and really describe and define for us what fatherless daughters encompasses and truly means beyond just presence. Help us understand that fatherless concept a little bit more.
Yeah, I can definitely do that. So for me, fatherless daughters means any woman that grows up with her father being absent, deceased, or physically there and emotionally unavailable. And many women don't even understand that the level of relationship that they had with their father is the result of why they're in some of the relationships that they're in. Because when your father is in the home, you don't look at yourself as being fatherless. But if you start to examine the type of relationship that you have with that father, was he around? Was he intentional about his interactions with you? Did he spend time with you, or was he always busy? Was he always working? Was he always watching the game or whatever it was? Did you always crave his attention? Were you doing things to try to get his attention? When you start to think about it that way, you might notice that you do have some areas that need to be healed because he wasn't as intentional with his relationship with you. So for me, I look at fatherlessness as being on a spectrum. And, you have the one side of the spectrum where your father is absent or deceased, and then you have the other one where your father is there and he's engaged. And we all fall someplace along that line. And depending on how far you are to the extent of him not being there, that is where you're going to really start to get, or not get, but you're going to have to start being a little bit more intentional about how does that show up in your relationships, because it always shows up. It always does.
Yeah, and you shared some reasons why fatherless daughters keep finding themselves in unfulfilling relationships. And what are some of those leading reasons why? And I think this is going to be key because I know I can identify with just about everything that you're saying, and I can relate to that journey. I can relate to the healing journey. I can relate to the deficiencies in the relationship and how it impacted many of my choices and behaviors. Like, I can relate to all of that. But I think even if there's someone who can find themselves on that spectrum you've talked about, they probably could still see areas where they may see reasons why they're finding themselves having an unfulfilled pattern or an unfulfilled relationship. Help us to understand some of those reasons.
Yeah, so the three main reasons that I see that you will be in unfulfilling relationships over and over again is a fear of rejection, a fear of abandonment, and a low sense of self-worth. With the first two, fear of rejection and abandonment are two of the fatherless daughter trigger points that I speak about when I'm talking to my clients about things. And the reason why I mention these, and most fatherless daughters have these, is because they have already experienced what being abandoned is like by their father in some way, whether he was in the home or he wasn't. And because you understand what it is to be abandoned, it is a feeling that when you were younger, you were not equipped to deal with, and it likely was not something that was processed. And so your brain has created the coping mechanisms and defense mechanisms to really encapsulate that so that you don't have to deal with it because you're just not ready to. And so you don't want to have to continue to have that kind of pain going forward. And so you will find yourself in relationships with people that aren't who you really want, that you know that there's no future there, that your needs and desires are not being met, that you know that you're just like unhappy in, but you stay because you don't want to feel like you're going to be rejected by this person if you start to speak up about what you really want and they can't give it to you, or you don't want to be abandoned by them if you start to assert your needs and desires and they're just like, you know what, I can't do this anymore. So you stay in these spaces because it feels safer for you to be someplace where you at least feel like you belong, even though you don't really feel like your most authentic self there, because that is at least better than you being alone and then having to reckon with yourself and your feelings about, why your father wasn't there or why your relationships don't work and stuff like that. So to me, it's really just a distraction that you're using in order for you to not have to deal with what you actually should be dealing with, because that's what's going to bring you to the amazing relationships. Right. And then the other thing is really just a low sense of self-worth. And that honestly just comes from the internalization of you thinking that because your father wasn't around, or because he never validated you, or because he just didn't pay you any mind if he was there, that something is wrong with you. And a lot of us internalize that feeling and use it as an indictment against our character, when really it is just the choice that they made, and it affected you, but it was not because of you. And that distinction is one that really needs to be made, because a lot of times we believe that it was because of us. And that is really just the lie that perpetuates the limiting beliefs that keep us in these unfulfilling relationships for far too long.
Yeah, that's really huge. And you talked about certain assertions that we need to make, and they're almost like affirmations or confirmations about ourselves that we need to make in the face of the trauma, I'll use that word, that we experience that might have been covert or overt, right? They may not have had that intention. And the one thing that I think that bears at least a small conversation is, this doesn't mean you don't love your dad.
Absolutely.
This doesn't mean that you don't care for him. This doesn't mean that you don't have some type of relationship with him.
Yeah.
It's really talking about some of the deficiencies that he may not have even known how to show up for you in
Yeah.
because of his own experience.
Hmm.
But I think it's identifying them and truly recognizing how they impacted us. And so this journey, I'm hopeful, is not a journey of placing blame, placing fault, trying to penalize, or even throw a face of accountability to them. I think what we have to recognize in most cases, obviously, in some cases, there is a point of forgiveness, there is a point of actions that need to be held accountable. But in most cases, people try to do the best that they can,
Yeah.
right? And we have had so many fractures in our history as a people that I'm not sure we got this whole thing nailed on any front yet. And so, what I don't want to have happen is people begin to hear this message and start thinking that they have been completely wronged by their dad, who may have been in their lives the best way he knew how. How do you direct and guide with that whole perspective?
Yeah, so that's a really great question, because it's definitely, it comes with you not looking at your father as your father, but looking at him as a man and as a person. And when we are able to kind of make the distinction between our father not just being our parent, but also a person who has had his own traumas, who has had his own upbringing, who has dealt with his own stuff, and then how has that informed how he has shown up in his relationships, then now we are able to kind of give some grace where we weren't able to before. And so that is one thing that I really kind of try to drive home with my clients, that yes, we are talking about the fact that your father wasn't there for you and he didn't show up the way you needed him to. And as a result of this, it has absolutely caused a lot of things to happen. However, let's look at your father as a man and understand that maybe his parents, your grandparents, really just weren't there for him in the way that he now understood what a parent should be. And if we can start to do those things, then I believe is where we can really get to understanding that, okay, grace needs to be shown in this space, and forgiveness can happen a lot easier when we start to give grace to people in that way.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the other things that you mentioned was like some of the assertions that I would be advising fatherless daughters to have. And it would absolutely be that they need to know without a shadow of a doubt that their father's absence is not an indictment against their character, worth, or value. That is absolutely a truth that I would need them to know. And this is something that I would even encourage them to be putting down on a cue card on their mirror, or wherever it is. Take a screenshot of it, have it in your phone, because even though this thing happened to you, it was not because of you. Their choice in no way diminishes who you are. and what you deserve. And then I would also invite them to get curious about how this pain is manifesting itself in their relationships and in their life, because that then would be the starting place on how they can start to heal and what areas they really need to focus on.
I would imagine that after that healing journey and that forgiveness journey is taken, there is the opportunity for reconciliation. Um, and there is the opportunity for a bridging. And what I mean by that is some conversations around how they can show up stronger and better now in relationships if there's an opportunity to make that connection with the father, if he's still available or if he's still around, or if connection can be made or contact can be made. And so I think that is absolutely huge, because one of the things I always love to say is, in order for us to soar relationally, we got to grow personally. And that
Yes.
is what you are really honing in on, is the personal growth, even in this space that we've got to reckon with what's going on with us. Like, what is happening with us to make us show up in this way in our relationships that we are having? So, how can someone begin assessing if this may be an impactful area for them, right? So they're hearing our conversation. They certainly can make connection based on their experience with their father, that they can say, yeah, I identify with that. But how can they say, is it impacting me? How can they begin that self-reflection?
Yeah, that's a really great question. What I would say there is I would start to really get curious about the things that are triggering to them.
Mhm.
And that means that what are the types of things that people say to you that really get you upset, that really kind of knock you off course? What are some of the things that really hurt your feelings? And what is really behind that?
Mhm.
What I have noticed about fatherless daughters is that a lot of us really have not been able to process our emotions in a healthy way. They
Mhm.
have not really been affirmed for us and stuff. So, what that looks like is that we will ignore a lot of the feelings that we have. And we will have like the big emotions like fear or anger or rage about something, but not really understand what's behind that.
Mhm.
And so, what I would say then for them is to just start to examine your triggers. If you can start to just do that one thing,
Mhm.
it's going to point you in the direction of where you need to heal,
Mhm.
and not looking so much at the initial feeling that you have about something, but what's behind that. So, yes, you're angry about what somebody said, but are you angry? Are you disappointed?
Mhm.
Are you embarrassed? Like, do you feel invalidated? Because these are all emotions that are behind anger, but they're not ones that we really process because we are typically just looking at the big emotions.
Mhm.
So when we start to like get deep into why we feel these things and really examine if it is just anger or if it's more than that, we get closer and closer to the root of why this thing triggers us in the way that it does. And once we're at that root, now we can pluck it out by really understanding where it came from, and then what can we do to self-soothe. Because once we understand what our self-soothing techniques are, then now we can ask people to partner with us in supporting us in the emotions that we have.
Mhm. So I'll give myself as an example, because as you were talking, I can think through an experience I had with my husband yesterday. So, in preparation for my daughter's graduation, we're trying to get all of our decorations and things in order to celebrate her. And so I have a certain expectation of what I wanted to occur. And so I tried communicating that. But I could also sense yesterday, and this is why it's so important to learn yourself, right? I could also sense yesterday that my vulnerabilities were at a high sensitivity, which meant that I was going to be easily triggered, right? And one of the things that's really hard for me that I can point back to my fatherless daughter experience is asking for help,
Mm-hmm.
especially asking for help from a male. Because in cases where I asked for help from my dad, he kind of didn't show up for me. Okay. And that's no slight against him. My dad is my dad. I love him, rest his soul. But he just didn't show up for me consistently. And so when I have to make myself available to ask for help from my husband, I do it on pins and needles,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
Because I am just not confident, even though his track record is good, right? After all of these years, and we've been married 26 years,
Wow.
and what he doesn't realize is that I'm still wrestling with what we're talking about right here, which was ingrained in me as a kid. So it's no shade to him to say, I don't think you're going to do. What it is a trigger for me to say, I am making myself open and vulnerable because I'm asking for help from a male that, in my experience, my early on signs say you're not going to show up and you're not going to do it. And so, where I have to begin to recognize is that he is not him. And even though his track record is long standing over many years, I still struggle with that.
Mm-hmm.
I still struggle with having confidence that you are going to come through for me, because what was ingrained in me as a kid was a no-show, was a no-show. And so I can relate to what you're saying. I can relate to how you begin to function in these relationships, and you at the beginning you try to make sure like you're good, right?
Yep.
And even though I have years of experience with my husband, and even though his track record is long standing and good for showing up, every time I ask, I brace myself, right? Because of where it all began for me. And uprooting that is a lifelong thing that you have to be conscious of. That's why when you talk about establishing those rules of engagement and talking about what's important to you and talking about how you need people to show up for you, that is absolutely powerful and key of how you made the connection to that childhood experience of being a fatherless daughter, and how it's impacting each and every one of us on that spectrum now. And so I think that's just really huge. And like I said, that's my own experience that I have to deal with time and time again. And I'm sure you have examples from your clients of where they wrestle with that, or even from your own experience. Do you have anything you want to share?
Yeah, actually, I do. As you were talking, the one thing that was coming to me was a routine of resistance.
Mhm.
And I have been speaking about this for days now. I really feel like the Lord has just continued to put this on my spirit, a routine of resistance, because this is something that is absolutely needed in order for you to be committed to the person that you are today and not reverting back to who you were before, not reverting back to allowing your fears to rule you. And so, one of the things that I tell my clients that should absolutely be in their routine of resistance is the idea of inspecting your fears. And so, what that looks like is that you're going to now look for the evidence of the things that you're afraid of.
Mhm.
You said that you're usually fearful and you're like on pins and needles anytime you have to ask your husband for help with something. But you know that his track record has been that when you have come to him with something, he has come through, you know? And so if you know that the evidence is telling you that the fear that you have is not real, then you need to focus on what's actually true right here in this moment. And so, yes, you are likely going to maybe have some apprehension about asking him for things going forward. And this may just be something that you constantly have to work through. But inspecting your fears and seeing if there's any evidence to support why you had this fear, is something that I would encourage you to do.
Mhm.
Because in doing that, you'll be able to see whether or not the fear is founded on anything real, or if this is just a residue of the relationship that you have with your father.
Mhm.
And if it's the residue, then it's work that you have to do around that. But you know for a fact that you can still walk in the truth of, my husband is going to be there for me when I ask him. He has always held space for me to be authentic and bring my full self to. He
Mhm.
has created the type of environment with me where I can be vulnerable and I know that I'm emotionally safe there. So,
Mhm.
because you know these things, you
Mhm.
can focus on the truth of that,
Mhm.
even if you're still a little bit scared to ask him things. So, that's what I would encourage you or anyone in that moment.
I love it because that's where the assertions come in, because it is making those type of assertions that begin to do that mindset shift.
Mm-hmm.
And I hope in my transparency that people begin to realize how impactful those childhood experiences are to how we function in our adult life,
Yeah.
how we function in our relationships. This isn't just happenstance that you're acting or feeling or being vulnerable in this way. You usually can pinpoint it back, as Bernadette has done, to an experience of something that has happened before that was traumatic to you. And we
Absolutely.
always want to we always want to liken trauma to being in the ER. That's not
Mm,
that's
yes.
not like, trauma is anything that distorts the truth or the reality of the situation in a way that causes impact to you and how you perceive moving forward. And so I just love how you're serving in this vein. I do have another question for you though.
Sure.
Is there an accountability that a mother plays when it comes to this? And do we ever misplace the blame?
That's a really great question. And I think it really depends on how the mother handled the situation. If it was a situation, let's say, where the mom encouraged her daughter not to have a relationship with her father,
Mm-hmm.
then that would be something that I would absolutely say, yes, she does have a part to play in it. If it's also a situation where the father wasn't there and she did not help her daughter to really process the feelings of grief around her father not being there, or affirm the feelings that she had in any way, or told her that she needed to just suck it up and just deal with it like we're all dealing with it. Any of these things would be absolutely reasons why I would say that yes, the mom does have a role to play in how the daughter was able to process things or lack thereof. But if it isn't any of those two things, then I would say no. Like, the mom really cannot force the father to be there. All she can do is love her daughter through it.
Mm-hmm.
And if she does that,
Mm-hmm.
and if she also tries to make sure that her daughter has a male mentor that is also going to love on her and to show her what it's like to have a male relationship where, she's being loved and she's being affirmed in that way from a man, then that's all she can really do in that moment.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in terms of misplacing blame, I feel like anytime we're dealing with big emotions, these things happen. People will sometimes put blame in areas where it doesn't belong. And it is a natural response that we have to huge emotions because we don't know if we should be taking these on ourselves or if they belong to someone else. But what I would say is not to really think about where the blame is placed, but to understand that your responsibility for healing is your own. So, regardless of what has happened to you, and who is to blame for that, your healing is your responsibility. And that's where I would focus.
Wow, that's awesome. It makes me think of when I was a kid. My parents divorced when I was really young. I actually don't remember living with both of them. What I remember as a kid, I remember being very young. I remember sitting on the couch with my coat on, waiting for my dad to come pick me up. I remember him not showing up. And that was a repeated behavior. No call, no show up, and me sitting there with my coat on. And for the longest time, I used to reflect and think, wow, I can't believe my mom let me sit there. all evening long with my coat on, waiting for him to come. Like,
Hmm.
I can't believe she would just let me sit there. But in that experience, I feel like she allowed me to get to know him on his own terms, right? She did not interject. She did not intercept. She did not try to explain. If he said he was coming, I'm going to let you wait on. Like, she didn't try to insert herself in that. It allowed me to begin to formulate, even with my own mind, the type of relationship he was looking to form, which I don't know if that was good or bad, but I never had any false pretense when it came to him, because however he showed up, what he did, what he didn't do, it all hung on his word, and he had to be accountable for it. I just think that that's very interesting that I had to sit in it that way, but I was never mistaken about who I was dealing with in that sense.
Yeah, I think that that's a really great point. And just to highlight what you're saying, it could very well be that your mom knew that if she had tried to tell you, you know what, I don't think your dad is coming, that you would have pushed back.
Mm-hmm.
And that pushback might have caused the kind of rift between you that she didn't want to have,
Mm-hmm.
you know? So it's like, it's such a hard situation when you're looking at your child and you know for a fact that they're going to be disappointed about something and there's nothing that you can do about it.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like you're in between a rock and a hard place when you're in those situations.
Mm-hmm.
Because on the one hand, it's like, you know that this has been a repeated offense, but you don't yet realize that, okay, this is what this might actually be.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's hard dealing with that. And I would probably say that it probably left you with these kind of feelings of always waiting for the other shoe to drop when you're in relationships, you know,
Mm-hmm.
because the waiting and the waiting and the waiting for someone that doesn't show up,
Mm-hmm.
that waiting feeling, that anxiety is things that you carry with you into adulthood.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's like it shows up in places where you're not, okay, I'm gonna ask, but I'm just gonna wait because I don't know if he's gonna come. I don't know if he's gonna do what he said he's gonna do. And that, I think, is honestly where your apprehension about asking your husband for things comes from.
Mm-hmm.
It's that waiting for your father and him not showing up. And that apprehension and that anxiety is what you still carry with you today, honestly.
Absolutely.
Like, that's the connection that I'm seeing with that.
Mm-hmm.
And so it makes a lot of sense, yes, what you're saying, but it is, and this is honestly why I was saying that, really looking at the connection between your father loss and what that story looks like and how you show up in relationships is critical, because now you can start to see some of the responses that you have to things and your triggers. And so you know that it is very triggering for you to ask for help, to ask people for things, and you usually have anxiety around that.
Mm-hmm.
And now we understand that if you were always waiting for your father to come, and if you were calling him like, Dad, I want to see you. Okay, baby, I'm coming. And he doesn't show up. Now it's telling you that, okay, the things that I need and my desires are not valued, and they're not going to be honored by the people that are supposed to love me.
Mm-hmm.
And so now what ends up happening is that you carry that with you, and you don't know if you should even tell people what you need, because you don't want to find out if they're not going to honor it. You know what I mean?
Absolutely.
Because now you have a decision to make. Like,
Absolutely.
what am I going to do here in this space?
Mm-hmm.
And it's hard for you to really see that, but it's necessary, because that's the only path forward for you to really be able to let people in on that.
Mm-hmm.
And telling your husband that, yes, this is why I feel the way that I do.
Mm-hmm.
This is why I have this anxiety around asking you things. It's not because I don't know that you're going to do it, or because I believe that you're not going to support me or show up for me,
Mm-hmm.
but it's because the little girl inside of me still needs to be soothed every now and then.
Mm-hmm.
And this is always going to be a trigger, but it's one that I am conscious of, at least. And now I know that I can make new responses. And a new response for you is that even though you're apprehensive, you still ask for the help.
Mm-hmm.
That is your new response.
Mm-hmm.
So I definitely see what you're saying.
Absolutely. And you know what? I was really deliberate in being transparent with my experience, because I know oftentimes where we listen to people like you who have had their overcoming story, we think, oh, that was great for them. But I want people beautiful to realize that there are a lot of people like me and you that share this story, that share these experiences and are impacted by what has happened to us as a kid. So me being transparent is really just to continue to shed a light on the great work that you're doing and the reason why it's necessary. Because we all have, like you said, that little girl that needs to be soothed, that unfortunately was our originating experiences.
Mm-hmm.
And it kind of sets the stage for how we grow upon that going forward. So that is one of the reasons why I wanted to be very intentional to share with you. And you didn't know I was going to share with you
I
that way.
didn't.
All right, so clearly your journey has prompted you to harness purpose and ultimately help others find themselves in your shoes. So you birthed the Her Coalition, and how did you recognize purpose in your pain? Because it's one thing to take that journey, but when did you say, this is purpose for me that I need to begin to serve here?
Honestly, I didn't recognize it at first. It was the Lord that kind of like pushed me into it. And he did that by just introducing me to fatherless daughters. And then in conversation with them, we would be talking about what was going on in their relationships or something about their father. And then I would just start to speak to them about the things that I had learned. And in doing that, like they started to kind of get revelations with me in conversations. And it kind of just grew from there. So really, I just thought that this was going to be something that I was doing for myself and that I would talk to my girlfriends about it and then I would share it with whoever wanted to hear. But it wasn't anything that I thought was really going to be a business or a purpose at all until I was just stripped of all of the things that were distracting me. And I feel like the Lord needed to do that for me because I kept telling him that now wasn't the time. Like he kept telling me like, listen, this is what I want you to do. And I kept saying, you know what, but I'm working, but you know, like I have this going on and that going on. So it wasn't until he stripped me of all of the things that I said were distracting me that I finally got serious about it. And in doing that, it was almost as if like everything started to come together. The provision that I needed to create this business and to create the platform that I have, Her Coalition, the one-on-one coaching that I offer, which is Her Way. All of these things came about right after I finally got serious about it. And when I did, I realized that there were so many women that I was already in community with that were dealing with the same issues that I was, and they just hadn't been saying anything about it. And the one thing that really drove me to get into this work was that when I was looking for my own solutions, I couldn't find any. Like I was telling you that I had spent like 3 years just in a cocoon, like just learning everything that I needed to learn. But it took that long because there just weren't any programs or any resources specifically for me. And I couldn't understand, like, if there are 84 million women that self-identify as fatherless daughters, why aren't there any programs specifically for us to really usher us into how we can have the types of relationships that we deserve and really helping us to understand how our father loss connects to the relationships that we have now outside of therapy? There really wasn't anything. And so when I started to just like walk myself through my own healing, I chronicled everything that I was doing. I journaled everything. I wrote down like what I was doing and what the result was. I did all of these things. And at the end of that, I realized that I had had a method for how I had gotten from really just not understanding what my father loss was doing to me and my relationships, and then how I started to experience the type of amazing relationships that I deserve simply by just showing up authentically and really healing the places in my life that were really broken.
And when you say relationships, just qualify that for us. Are you talking about love interest or are you talking about the full gamut of what surrounds you?
I'm talking about the 360 view of relationships, relationships with your mom, relationships with your relatives, with your coworkers, with your friends, and with your significant other, and with yourself. We can't forget that one. Every relationship is definitely going to be affected by the work that you do on yourself. And if you decide not to do it, it's going to be affected anyway. And so I'm just meaning that all of the relationships that you have, you really need to be thinking of how are you showing up in those spaces, because everything that I'm talking about is really just about every interaction that you have with people. It's not just romantic partners.
That's awesome. So tell us how we can get connected to the Heart Coalition for people who are making a connection with what you're saying and want to be able to connect with you in the work that you're doing.
Oh, yeah, definitely. So if you want to be a part of my private Facebook group, Her Coalition, you can go to bernadettejackson.com/community to join. And if you realize that you're a fatherless daughter who needs some assistance, you realize that the relationships that you've been having are not the ones that you've wanted, and you yearn for something deeper, and you know that you just need someone to help you to connect the dots between what your father loss has actually impacted your relationships to be, then you can partner with me in my relationship intensive, Her Way. And so if you're interested in learning more information about how to be a part of Her Way, then you can go to bernadettejackson.com/Her Way. And that will really give you all of the information that you need about that program, whether or not we are a good fit for each other, and how I could support you in this journey to get from not understanding how that really works and how your father loss has affected you, and to the mastering your emotions and really just understanding how your father loss has affected you, but then what's the path forward for you to get some healing and then start to experience the relationships that you deserve. And if you just want to just understand a little bit more about fatherlessness and some of the areas that it affects you overall, you can also follow me on Instagram, because I do give a lot of content there to my audience, and you can follow me at Bernadette N. Jackson.
Okay, awesome. We definitely want to support, and I'll make sure I put all of that information in the show notes so that people can get to it. So around here, we love to challenge everyone to build a life they love without apology. And we always close out with the LLH questions. So I'm going to ask you 3 questions, and I want you to just kind of chime in with your wisdom. So tell me, what's your life wisdom? What would you tell your younger self about life if you could?
That's a good one. Okay. So I would tell my younger self that you deserve amazing relationships, and nothing that you've done and no person that couldn't see it disqualifies you from that.
Amen. I love that. What love wisdom would you give your younger self if you could?
I would tell my younger self that self-love is a starting place for you to give and receive love, and that you cannot express to or receive from others what you are unwilling to give to yourself.
That's so good. And then finally, what's your happiness wisdom? What would you tell your younger self about happiness if you could?
Oh, yeah, definitely. So I would tell my younger self to just get curious about yourself and what you actually like. I would find out like what your likes are, what you're great at, what you're really passionate about, what brings you joy. And then I would start doing more of those things. And then upon doing those things, I would then invite people into the space to do those things with me, and then to share with me what it is that brings them to their happy space as well.
You know what, Bernadette, talking with you has just been a joy. As I started with, and the reason why I started with thank you is because I can connect to how you serve. My own experiences resonate exactly with where you have committed to help others, and I commend you for being transparent, available, and open. And the very last thing that I want to say to you is I want you to know that success looks so good on you. And thank you.
Thank you so much. It was such a pleasure talking to you, and I really loved being here. And I really thank you for being transparent with me as well, because this conversation was so beautiful and it was so needed. So I appreciate you.
Absolutely. Thank you. Now, what I love about my conversation with Bernadette is this. She creates a safe place for fatherless daughters to learn, grow, and heal. I think you heard from my own experience how that is still a journey for me to overcome and get past. It's trauma that happens on the inside of us. But here's the thing I believe to be true. We all deserve good relationships in our lives that edify us and build us up. But I also know that we have to be willing to grow personally in order to soar relationally. That is why the work that Bernadette is doing is so powerful. I hope that if you need to connect with her, you will. I hope that you understand you're worth the effort of understanding why failed relationships may be happening. It could be because of the trauma that you experience from being a fatherless daughter. Now, I hope that you love this podcast. In fact, I hope a nugget was shared. Reach out to me. My email is everywhere. It's denise@denisetaylor.live. Tell me a nugget or two that was impressive to you, one that you can apply to your life. I'm on Facebook. You can message me there. I'm also on Instagram. You can certainly DM me there. I'd love to hear what wisdom you took away from the episode, and I look forward to seeing you next time.
Well, that's it, beautiful. Thank you for tuning in. Don't ever forget that you truly deserve life, love, and all the happiness your heart can hold. Be relentless in building a life you love without apology. I'm Denise Taylor, and you can always find me in our free Facebook community. Life, love, in the pursuit of happiness, easy to find. Now, if you want more information about my success superpowers, as I'm sure you do, download my free Success Superpowers ebook at denisetaylor.live/podcast. And one last thing, always embrace your power and go.